Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Way Out Stories, Volume 2, Story Number 1. I lived in a small two-bedroom house in Smyrna, Georgia with my parents for about 8 years, beginning in 1987. At first, nothing really noticeable happened, but then, after we got settled in good, I started seeing things out of the corner of my eyes, like little black shadows that would peep around the corner but would disappear when I looked directly at the spot. I never thought this was anything abnormal. Then later on, my mom told me she would have weird dreams when she was alone in the house. She said she would fall asleep in the chair and would dream about things like being chased or playing with a dog, and the dog would bite her and it hurt so bad it woke her up. I never thought this was weird either because I did things like that, and I always thought that your subconscious mind didn't know the difference between what is real or what is a dream. But since we moved, neither one of us has had these sort of dreams anymore. She also admitted to seeing things out of the corner of her eye like I did, but she never mentioned anything other than that and her dreams. One time, me and her, we were the only ones in the house, and I was sitting in a chair that was backed up against the front door, and directly on the other side of the door was a small sidewalk and then some bushes. I heard some breathing, like a dog panting, fast, like it was running, but it stayed in one place long enough for me to notice. Then it sounded like someone ran behind me and disappeared. I only heard the breathing and not the actual sound of the feet hitting the ground. I asked my mom if she heard it, and she didn't since she was in the kitchen right next to the living room. And it couldn't have been an actual dog running by the door. I thought this because it was so loud, and honestly, I didn't hear any feet hitting the ground. Then one time I remembered I was laying in my bed facing the wall and just about drifted off to sleep when I distinctly heard someone behind me whisper my name real loud. I jumped and turned over, but no one was there. Needless to say, I didn't sleep very well that night. My bedroom was also where I would notice the shadows out of the corner of my eyes the most. Sometimes I would also jerk awake for no reason. I told my dad once that I hit the bed so hard when I jerked awake that it was almost like I was floating above my bed while I was asleep, and when I woke up, I would fall back into the bed. One other time, and this was the part of the story that I forgot until recently, I was in the house alone. My parents had gone to church or somewhere, and I had a lot of studying to do, so I stayed home. It was during the summer, so the kitchen window was open, and the chairs had been moved and replaced by a couch in front of the front door. I was sitting on the couch, and it was nearly dusk. I was sleepy, so I put the two pillows from the couch on my lap and bent forward to rest my eyes for a minute. I heard what I thought was my parents coming home. Since the house is so small, you can just about see in all the rooms from the living room, and the door from the driveway is not that far away. Anyway, I heard them coming through the door, and when I tried to get up to look, I couldn't. It was like I was held down in that position, and all I could do was listen. I started to panic, and I was very awake at this time. I heard footsteps going back and forth across the kitchen, and I thought it was my mom. So I tried to call to her because I thought something was wrong with me. But I couldn't even talk. All I could do was moan. And still, it didn't come out very loud. I heard blinds bang across the kitchen window like the wind was blowing, and the footsteps continued. It sounded like they would walk up to the edge of the kitchen where the carpet for the living room starts, then turn around and go back. All these sounds were going on at the same time, and all I could think of was I was drugged, and someone was robbing the house with me laying right there. After a while, I drifted off again, but it was like a forced sleep. Believe me, I did not want to sleep. But when I woke up a few minutes later, I could move and talk just fine. I looked in the kitchen, and everything was in place, and the curtains weren't moving. What made it even weirder was there was no wind that day, and our kitchen windows didn't even have blinds. I never really thought about all this stuff being attributed to ghosts or anything like that. I never gave it much thought, although I knew it was possible, But if I had realized what was going on when it was happening, I probably would have been scared senseless. Also, during the time most of this was going on, I couldn't stop thinking about my grandfather, who had been dead since I was about 4 or 5. One night he came to me in a dream, and ever since the thoughts have left me. And very soon after, we moved in with my uncle, who was close to my dad, and he was killed in a terrible way. Then I found out that an older woman had died in the house, and before that it was rented out and people had a lot of drug parties. But I don't know if they were into anything occult. To me it sounds like most of this stuff can be explained by something being wrong with me, like my continuous thoughts could have caused the dream to happen, or the other things could have been because I was extremely tired or over-imaginative. But it just seems like too much stuff to be coincidence. However, I was the only one who said anything about anything weird going on. My dad never said he saw or felt anything, and my mom never said anything other than seeing shadows and her dreams. I forgot all about being paralyzed on the couch, and then it just popped into my mind, and I knew it had to be something out of the ordinary. What do you think? Next story. This story took place in Denver, Colorado in the late 1979. I was stationed at Lowry Air Force Base for training at the Air Force Air Intelligence Training Center. I consider myself a very objective person, but this incident shook me up. I'll relate the events as accurately as possible, and you be the judge. My roommate at the time was an older guy, 26 or so, from Kentucky. I was 18 and had only been in the Air Force 3 or 4 months. Like many people, I was interested in paranormal activity and began reading some books on the subject. One of these books mentioned a ritual on how to summon a demon. My friends and I were contemplating a trip to a reportedly haunted old hotel, the Peck House, in Empire, approximately an hour or so away. So this kind of subject was often on my mind at the time. Anyway, one evening in our room on base, my roommate and I were playing around and tried to summon this demon by name. I don't recall where I got the name from, but wouldn't have given it out anyway. At one point, we both began to feel a coldness that I referred to as an ion wind coming from the corner of the room where my bed was located. Well, after some time, we attributed it to a draft or something. This was winter in Denver, and nothing significant happened, so we got ready for bed. We each had a twin-sized bed in the same room. After laying down on my bed, I noticed that it was vibrating pretty violently, almost like those old magic finger beds in motels. This scared me pretty bad, to the point that I jumped across the room into my roommate's bed, vowing that I would not sleep in mine. Of course, like young guys do, he ridiculed me pretty badly and laughed. He said he'd sleep in my bed. Well, almost as soon as his head hit the pillow, his eyes got wide as saucers, and he jumped up from the bed, bellowing that the damn thing was moving. This guy was not the type of person to be intimidated easily, and I was nearly as frightened by his reaction as I was by the incident itself. After 17 years, I don't really remember how we passed the night, but I do recall that after this incident that we both started missing things. I don't believe he had anything to do with it, since we were both required to be in classes all day without much opportunity to get back to the room for mischief. Specifically, I remember one case where I was missing one of my combat boots from a pair I often wore. Our room consisted of one main living bedroom area, about 12 feet by 15 feet, a small bathroom, and 2 closets. Not many places to lose things in such a small place. I looked everywhere for that boot, but was not able to find it. Then one day I came home from class, and there was my boot in the middle of the floor, where I couldn't have missed it with my eyes closed. Just a few days after all this, we both relocated to different rooms with different roommates, and I never heard any reports of strange happenings in that room. I was just glad to be out of there. I take this type of occurrence much more seriously than before. Next story. When I was in college in Rock Hill, South Carolina, I lived in a house that was built by my great-grandfather in 1915. He had died there in the 40s, and my great-grandmother lived there until her death in 1978. She was quite fond of me. I was her first great-grandchild and was named after her husband. The house was a 2-story Victorian style, hidden from the road by 2 huge drooping oak trees. After Jinx died, Jinx was a nickname my great-grandmother acquired in childhood, on account of her name having been Annie Lucky. It stuck for a lifetime. Anyhow, after she died, my grandfather, her son, divided the house into 3 large apartments to rent to college students. The house was situated only about 3 blocks from the main campus at 232 Oakland Avenue. When my turn came to go to school, I naturally took up residence in the upstairs apartment. I had 2 roommates, and the 2 apartments downstairs each had 2 residents. After a couple of months, my roommates approached me with some strange experiences they had. It seemed that some nights they would awaken to the feeling that they were not alone in the room. The feeling was quite overwhelming, and despite investigating, they found nothing. I admitted to having had the same feeling, but we attributed it to the old and rather spooky nature of the house itself. However, other residents of the house, with whom we were only passing acquainted, universally reported the same feeling. One would be awakened from a dead sleep to the undeniable feeling that someone else was in the room. Attributing the feeling to the old house was not enough for one of my roommates, who was so disturbed by this phenomena, he packed up his belongings and moved in with his girlfriend. A few weeks later, a girl who lived in one of the downstairs apartments became so frightened by this unseen presence that she abruptly moved out as well. I was unsettled by this also, but after all, if there was a spirit in the house, it must be a member of my own family. Those of us who remained in the house continued about our business, clinging to the sentiment that the unseen presence must be some collective psychological phenomena brought on by living in an old house. This was the situation until early one morning about May 1990. I had just begun summer school at Winthrop in an attempt to finally graduate and was heading out the door to an 8 a.m. class. I was coming down the exterior stairs of our apartment, which led to the driveway beside the house, when I was met by the girl who lived in one of the downstairs apartments. Beth was an art student at Winthrop, and I barely knew her. This morning she was visibly distraught, and had obviously been waiting outside on the front porch for me to come down. When she gathered her composure, she relayed to me a most frightening yarn. The night before, she had been reading in her bed quite late, and petting her cat, which was laying on the bed beside her. At some instant, the cat went rigid and began to hiss at something across the room. Beth put down her book and looked up to see, to her utter shock, the ethereal form of a tiny old woman sitting in a chair about 10 feet from her. She stared in horror for a few seconds when the form disappeared into thin air. She immediately rose, dressed hurriedly, and spent the remainder of the night on the front porch. Her artsy nature and her strange clothing style caused me at first to write her off for a story, to drugs, alcohol, weirdness, or some mixture thereof. I reassured her as best I could and continued to class. Later that day, I was at my father's house, and I told him Beth's story. My father's more disposed than I was to believing in such things, and asked if I would introduce him to Beth. Jinx was his grandmother, and they were very close. I called her from his house, and I believe that she agreed to see him only because he owned the house she counted on for shelter. We arranged a meeting for that very evening. Before we left, my father pocketed a clear picture of Jinx to show Beth. When we arrived at the old house, Beth was still a bit uneasy. She repeated the story for my dad, who then listened and then asked if she would look at Jinx's picture. She reluctantly agreed. When he held it out to her, she regarded it for all of 2 seconds, when tears welled up in her eyes, and she wilted into a nearby chair, after pushing the picture out of her sight. No professional actor could have simulated the terror we saw in that girl's face when she was confronted with the living image of the figure she had seen the night before. When we calmed her, my father wanted to see the spot where she had seen the apparition. I was stunned but not overly surprised when the bedroom she indicated had belonged to Jinx in life and was the very room in which she drew her final breath. Before the sun had set on the following day, Beth moved out of our old house and would never set foot in it again. A couple of months later, I graduated from school and left 232 Oakland Avenue myself. The events of that day, coupled with my own experiences prior, created one more firm believer in the supernatural. Next story. I'd like to share an experience my mom had that she has related to me a couple of times when I was younger. When she was a young girl in the late 1940s in Germany, She lived in an apartment with her parents and two older sisters. She and her sisters shared a bedroom in the attic. She said that on some nights she would be visited by a monk-like figure in a robe and hood who put his hands around her neck and would try to strangle her. She could never see its face, being obscured by the hood. She always knew the nights when these visitations would occur because she would be awakened by a light shining in her face and then would hear slow footsteps coming up the attic stairs. Too paralyzed with fear to move, or maybe by something else, she could only lie there and wait and watch helplessly until it made its appearance. She even tried to trick it one night by ducking down under the covers to the foot of the bed, but it only lifted the covers at that end instead. Her sisters never awoke to see what was going on, and she couldn't tell her parents, my grandparents, who were very strict, and she might get punished for telling stories. The experiences didn't cease until they finally moved away. To this day, it still bothers her to talk about it, but she has considered going to a hypnotist to see if it really happened or not, but she is afraid it will somehow find her again. Anyhow, this story always gives me the willies, as it's one of the only first-hand experiences I've ever heard of. Next story. I don't know if you can really call this a ghost story, but it was enough to scare me. We lived in Milton Hershey, which is a private school for social orphan children. I'm a house parent's son, so while the students went to their real homes for vacation, I stayed there because that was home to me. There was a rumor that a boy hung himself in the attic of the house, but we could never get it confirmed or denied. The first thing that happened was Mom and one of the students were in the house by themselves. They were both sitting in the kitchen when they heard somebody run down the stairs, run back up, and slam a door. The student ran outside, that she was scared, and when Dad got back, he looked around, but nothing was there. The second thing that happened was the students were home on vacation and Mom was checking their rooms. It was dark out, and as she walked down the hallway, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned around thinking it was Dad, but nobody was there. There weren't even any rooms to duck into, it was just walls. There was a closet door upstairs that would never stay shut. We would shut it, walk in a room, and when we came back out, the door would be open again. The students wouldn't shut it, and it still always came open. We locked it, we put stuff in front of it, but it still came open. It would stay closed as long as we stood there, but as soon as we left, it would pop open again. Probably the scariest thing happened in the basement. There's a big room down there that is split in half. The ping pong table was on one side, and the TV and stereo were on the other. You had to walk through a door into the ping pong side, then walk through an opening into the other side of the room, so there was only one way in. While we were playing ping pong, there were four of us. The radio came on just long enough for us to run around to the other side. Just before we came into view of it, it shut off. We looked at it, and here it was, on tape, so it could have been playing the radio like it was. Like everything else, there was no one hiding or playing tricks. The home was remodeled, and after that, we never had problems again. Next story. My story starts in 1969. I was 5 years old. My brother and I shared a bedroom. Our twin beds were arranged side by side, with the foot of the beds facing our door, which entered into the upstairs hallway. If you were in our room and facing the doorway, to the right of the door hung a picture of the map of the world. If you were laying in our beds, to your right would have been our closet door. This was a walk-in closet. I'm describing the layout so you can get a sense of how this all seemed to happen. Anyway, my bed was the one nearest to the closet door. The first time I saw the man in the barrel, it was around 3 a.m. It was a summer night in Iowa, and not too hot, not too cool. I awoke and saw something that has periodically haunted me to this day. I'm now 32 years old. To describe this figure will take some work. The figure looked very much like a troll. He appeared to be approximately 2 to 3 feet tall. He seemed to either be wearing a barrel or standing inside it. His feet were exposed outside the bottom of the barrel, and he was wearing shoes, much like that of an elf. The toes of the shoes curled at the ends. At the top of the barrel, straps were connected and hung over his shoulders. He had very sharp and long fingernails, dirty hands and arms, jagged, sharp teeth, a very long, dirty beard, and wore a hat that, now as I reflect back, looked like something from a Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale. The hat had a round brim and a long pointed top. His eyes were eerie and piercing, a gray color with pupils shaped like a cat's but as black as the devil's. This troll figure appeared at approximately the same time on each of his visits to haunt me, and was almost always floating in front of the map of the world. He was pointing his finger at me, floating up and down very slowly. He was laughing, but no noise was heard. I can remember quickly covering my head with my sheets during this first encounter, hoping that when I uncovered my head he would be gone and I was dreaming. When I removed the sheets from my head, he was indeed gone. However, for about a period of a year from night to night, this man would return, and I would go through the same routine of covering my head. Usually, when I saw him, he would be in front of that map. On other occasions, he would be to my right, in front of our closet door. Always he was laughing and pointing at me. Never really talking or explaining why he was tormenting me. No noise was ever made. During many nights, just before I was fully awake, I knew he was there. I didn't even have to look to know. I could feel his presence. Several times I would wake up, my brother yelling and asking my brother if he could see him. My brother, older than me, would tell me to go back to sleep, since I was just imagining it. To this day, my brother can describe him as clear as details I can, how this man looked. The reason he can is because in the middle of the night, while I was looking at this man, I would describe him to my brother to convince him the ghost was there. I had told my parents about seeing this man and asked them to remove the map of the world from the wall, as I felt this might have something to do with seeing him. They took down the map, but the man kept coming back. I asked them to move me into what was our guest room. They agreed to my wishes, but things only got worse. In that room, there was also a walk-in closet. If you can picture a clothes bar that was hung with U-shaped wall mounts, the clothes bar rested in those mounts, connected to the wall. One night, a loud crash came from my closet. I ran to my parents' room without investigating first. I woke them, and they went to my room closet. When they opened the door, everything was laying on the floor. The shelves that held my games and toys, and the clothes bar, and all my clothes. How this all came crashing down, nobody knows. But I have a strong suspicion that it was the man I had been seeing. For several nights from that day forward, he would return to laugh at me and haunt me. Although I haven't had visits from him since we moved from that house in Iowa, I can still remember the chills he gave me. Next story. Let me introduce myself and let you know that this story took place when I was a graduate student at Texas A&M International in Laredo, Texas. I was there studying for my master's degree. Now, my sister, she was one of those who told me all these cool ghost stories, and she had graduated from Incarnate World University in San Antonio. Now, that university was founded by the Sisters of the Order of the Incarnate Word, hence the name. The campus is composed of the main building, which is over 100 years old, and much newer buildings that contain the dorms, rec center, cafeteria, etc. The main building is 4 stories high and contains the administration offices on the first floor, dorms in the second, third, and fourth floors, and the basement houses the student laundry room, the mail room, and a small recreation room. Hardly anybody uses the facilities in the basement, though. Why? Because that's where the creepy stuff happened, mostly, especially at night. On the third floor, in addition to dorms, there's a small chapel where students would go to pray on their own time or attend the services offered on Sundays. A lot of the nuns had their rooms in the main building also. There's this one room, though, that had been nailed shut for decades. Over 50 years before, a nun committed suicide by hanging herself in that room. After the incident, the priest blessed the room, left all her belongings like they found them, and nailed the door shut. Students have been reporting ghost sightings and other things ever since. My sister got there in the fall of '93. Her first dorm room was on the third floor of the main building. In fact, all new students that needed dorms had to live in the main building. The newer surrounding buildings were for juniors and seniors. One of our first friends at the school was a girl named Caroline. Caroline was from Spain and was a sophomore when my sister got there. She was also a resident assistant. A resident assistant is a student who is assigned to a certain floor and is in charge of attending to whatever the students need as far as their dorms are concerned. One night, Caroline had just done her nightly rounds and was ready to go to bed when two female students came knocking at her door. The students had just come to their dorms after being in the library all night cramming for an exam, and when they arrived they found all their furniture and belongings completely rearranged. Nothing was missing or broken, just rearranged. They thought it was a practical joke, but no one else had the key to their dorm. The only person who kept a spare key was the resident assistant, and those were kept under lock and key themselves. Caroline called the San Antonio Police Department and they came over to take a look, and no sign of forced entry was found. Naturally, the girls were worried that someone was able to break into their dorm so easily despite the tight security. The resident assistant let them stay in an unoccupied room for the night while the cops dusted for fingerprints. There were no fingerprints found other than those of the girls themselves, except for one. One of the cops noticed a smudge in the window, dusted it, and lifted it. To their shock, the smudge was a huge handprint, larger than a normal human one. Another strange thing was that the print was found on the outside of the window, and the fact that the dorm was 3 floors up made it more intriguing. There were no signs of the window's lock having been forced open. In fact, the window was extremely hard to open since it hadn't been opened in years. But get this, one of the priests went to the room that night and saw that the room had been rearranged in the exact same way the room was when the nun killed herself. The reason that the priest knew what it was that he was one of the few people who had actually been inside the nun's room. The mysterious handprint is still on file at the San Antonio Police Department. Next story. This was my only encounter with a ghost. I'm not special, I don't have powers or whatever, this just happened to me. I wish it hadn't. In the 1950s, my school was a boarding school. The building is in one of the calm neighborhoods of the city and is surrounded by trees. It was an all-girl institution and the students were miserable. One day a girl named Sandra was punished for not listening in class. She was locked in one of the bathrooms of the 3rd floor for several hours. Sandra went ballistic. She was kicking, screaming, and threatening to kill herself. The sisters apparently forgot her, and when they came back to get her, she had disappeared. She had written death threats with her own blood on the walls. No window was open because of the steel bars. They never found her. That bathroom is now dammed and locked with a chain. One day after school, I was finishing my latest art project. The art classroom is on the 3rd floor, just next to the bathroom. When I finally finished and stepped in the corridor, I heard faint crying and yelling coming from that bathroom, and saw a frail shadow lurking around. I swear, I was completely freaked out. I had nightmares for weeks after that. I was always skeptical about ghost stories, although I enjoyed them greatly. Since the Sandra story, I'm a complete believer. Next story. My experiences have been many and varied, all of which have occurred since moving to Florida in 1981. When I moved here, I lived with my mother and brother in an old house in Jacksonville, in the Riverside area, which is filled with historic homes, many of which have been renovated. My room was in the converted attic, and my brother's was downstairs next to the back porch. Many times when I climbed the stairs to my room, I would pass a very cold spot, and often I could hear a song in my head. When I would go to turn on the radio in my room, the very song would be on the exact point I had heard it. My brother also swore he had seen the figure of a woman in white on the stairs. He had a distinct dislike for the room he was in and convinced my mother to allow him to make a room in the attic with me. I always felt uneasy in his room, as well, and detested the back porch even in broad daylight. We never did find out anything about the house, but my mother confirmed to me many years later that she too had felt weird things in the house. I had one strange experience in the apartment we lived in next. I was dating a certain boy, and one night, coming home from work, I very clearly heard him speak my name, as if he was standing behind me. He was 20 miles away at the time, but the minute I opened the door, the phone rang, and it was him calling. The most weird things that ever happened to me occurred when I was living with a roommate in a small house on the south side of Jacksonville. Some friends and I were playing around with automatic writing, and when one of the girls was writing, we all felt this electric shock go through us. It was so strong it caused the metal of my earrings to leave black marks on my ears. Then I started having very bad nightmares, which I would run screaming from my room. Not long after that, both my roommates and I started hearing noises in the spare room, like paper shuffling, and my roommate would find her filing cabinets open. The nightmares intensified, and then I started hearing the paper shuffling noise in my room, often right next to my head when laying in bed. Eventually, my friends consulted a Ouija board. Not the best of sources, I admit. And they told me that the presence in the house was a man named Richard, who had come back to the house to watch over me and protect me from what I did not know. Later, my roommate found out that a man had died in the house named Richard, who had been an accountant. One time we were discussing this man in the living room and actually felt him come into the room. All the hairs on my body raised up at the same time. We thanked him for his help, and then he left the room. After I started dating a new man who I later married, we stopped hearing any signs of Richard. I suppose the matter-of-fact nature of my husband was protection enough. A few years later, after leaving that house, I found out there was a witch's coven practicing in the woods behind their house. As soon as I left that house, my nightmares abruptly stopped, and I haven't had any outstanding incidents of the ghostly kind.